The desperate signal. The control room of the Deathworlder flagship, Iron Vow, was quiet except for the faint hum of machinery. The crew worked efficiently, their movements precise and calculated. These were not ordinary humans. They were Deathworlders, forged by the harshest conditions of their planet, a world known for its relentless storms, unforgiving terrain, and predators that would make most species shudder. Captain Race stood at the center of the room, his sharp eyes scanning the holographic map projected before him. He was tall, his features chiseled, his presence commanding. Around him, his officers waited, ready for his command. Suddenly, a shrill alert broke the silence. A communications officer, a young woman with a focused expression, called out, "Captain, we've intercepted a distress signal." The room shifted. Everyone turned toward the large screen as the officer worked quickly to decode the message. Within moments, a trembling voice filled the room, speaking in broken galactic standard. "This, Vorthan Council. We need help. Zekar Horde attacking. Please, save us." The message was punctuated by static and the sounds of chaos. Explosions, screams, and the unmistakable roar of alien weaponry. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but Captain Rice remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the screen. "Run the data," Riz ordered. The communications officer nodded, pulling up a detailed analysis of the signal. A three-dimensional image of a planet appeared, its surface marred by fire and destruction. Ships swarmed above it, Zekar warships, sleek and deadly, their red hulls glowing ominously. "It's real," the officer confirmed. "The Vorthans are under attack." "Zekar Horde," one of the lieutenants muttered. The name alone carried weight, a reminder of the horrors the Deathworlders had faced years ago. The Zekar Horde was infamous across the galaxy, merciless conquerors who left nothing but ashes in their wake. Riss narrowed his eyes. Memories surfaced, memories of a Deathworlder colony reduced to rubble, of friends and family lost to the Zekar's cruel invasion. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. The Zekar Horde had been a thorn in their side for too long. "They're begging for aid," another officer said, his tone almost mocking. "Do they think we're some kind of galactic saviors?" "No," Race said, his voice calm but cold. "They think we're their last hope." The room fell silent again. No one dared to speak, waiting for Race to make his decision. Deathworlders were known for their independence, their refusal to get involved in the galaxy's endless conflicts. But this was different. This was personal. "Pull up the details on the Zekar fleet," Riz ordered. The holographic map shifted, displaying the enemy ships. The Zekar Horde had brought an armada. Hundreds of warships, heavily armed and ready for battle. The odds were grim. "They outnumber us 10-1, one officer said, his voice tinged with concern. Rice smirked, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Good. That means they won't expect what's coming." The crew straightened, a ripple of anticipation spreading through the room. Deathworlders didn't shy away from a fight, especially not one that promised vengeance. Race turned to his first officer, a seasoned warrior named Commander Alric. "Prepare the fleet," Race said. "We're answering their call, not to save them, but to teach the Zekar Horde a lesson they'll never forget." Alric saluted, his expression grim but determined. "Yes, Captain." As the crew sprang into action, Race stared at the image of the burning Vorthan planet. He could almost hear the screams, the echoes of a tragedy he had lived through before. But this time, things would be different. This time, the Deathworlders would strike first. "Send a message to the Vorthans," Race said. "Tell them to hold on. Reinforcements are on the way." The communications officer hesitated. "What should we say exactly, sir?" Rice thought for a moment before replying, his voice low and firm. "Tell them, the Deathworlders are coming." The officer nodded, quickly transmitting the message. Across the fleet, soldiers prepared for battle. Weapons were armed, engines roared to life, and the ships began to move, aligning themselves for the jump to hyperspace. As the Iron Vow led the Armada, Reyes stood at the observation deck, watching the stars outside. His mind raced with strategies, calculating every possible outcome. He knew the risks. The Zikar horde was a formidable enemy, and this mission could end in disaster. But for the Deathworlders, failure was not an option. "We'll show them," Riz muttered to himself. "We'll show the galaxy what it means to cross a Deathworlder." The fleet entered hyperspace, disappearing into the void. The only sound in the control room was the steady hum of the ship's engines, a quiet prelude to the storm that was about to unfold. Far away, on a planet engulfed in flames, the Vorthans clung to hope. They didn't know what kind of warriors the Deathworlders were, but they would soon find out. And so would the Zikar horde. The mission revealed. The Deathworlder fleet hurtled through hyperspace, the stars stretching into blurred lines of light around them. On board the Iron Vow, Captain Rice stood before his officers in the briefing chamber. The air was thick with anticipation. They all knew this mission wasn't just about helping an alien race. It was about settling an old score. Commander Alric stood beside Rice, his expression grim. He tapped a control panel, and the holographic display lit up with images of the Zikar horde. The fleet stared at the projection of the sleek, crimson warships bristling with weaponry. "The Zikar horde," Alric began, his deep voice carrying across the room, "a plague on the galaxy. For centuries, they've left nothing but ruin in their path. Planets burned, civilizations erased. And we," his voice faltered slightly, his eyes hardening, "we've suffered too." The room was silent, but the tension was palpable. These warriors didn't need reminders. They bore the scars of the last Zikar invasion, scars that weren't just physical. Riz stepped forward, his gaze sharp. 12 years ago, they came to us. They thought Deathworlders would break like everyone else. They thought our world would crumble under their fire. He gestured to the room, his voice rising. "But we didn't break. We fought. We bled. And though we drove them back, we paid the price. Families lost. Cities destroyed. That's what they do, destroy and move on, like nothing happened." His words hit hard. Even the youngest among them knew the story. The Zikar horde didn't just defeat their enemies. They erased them, leaving behind nothing but ashes. "But this time," Rez continued, his voice cold and steady, "we're not just defending. We're going to show them what it means to fight a Deathworlder. No mercy, no retreat." Alric nodded and turned back to the display. "Here's the situation. The Vorthan homeworld, Axar Prime, is under siege. The Zikar have deployed a massive fleet, over 200 warships and ground forces. Their strategy is the same as always: obliterate the population, strip the planet of resources, and move on." He paused, bringing up a tactical map of Axar Prime. The planet's cities were highlighted in red, surrounded by clusters of Zikar ships. "The Vorthans are holding them off, but barely," Alric continued. "Their defenses are failing. If we don't act fast, there won't be anyone left to save." One of the officers, a younger man named Lieutenant Cade, leaned forward. "With respect, sir, how are we supposed to take on a fleet that size? They outnumber us 10 to 1. Rice smirked, his eyes glinting with something dangerous. "Numbers don't win wars. Strategy does, and Deathworlders don't fight fair." He gestured toward Alric, who brought up a new set of schematics. "We have something they don't expect," Race said. "The Iron Vow isn't just a flagship. It's carrying the most advanced weapon in our arsenal, the Helios Cannon." The room stirred. The Helios Cannon was a weapon of legend, a project whispered about but never confirmed. It was said to harness the energy of a star, capable of obliterating entire fleets in a single blast. Alric nodded. "The cannon is untested, but if it works, it'll turn the tide. Our plan is simple. We'll engage the Zikar fleet head-on, draw them into range, and deploy the cannon. Meanwhile, A strike team will infiltrate their flagship to disrupt their command structure. Cade frowned. And if the cannon fails? Rise's smirk widened. Then we fight like hell, and make sure they regret ever hearing the name Deathworlder. The officers exchanged glances. It was a bold plan, bordering on reckless. But that was how Deathworlders operated. They thrived on impossible odds. What about the Vorthens? Another officer asked. Are we evacuating them? Riz shook his head. No, they're staying. They need to see what real warriors look like. They've spent too long cowering. It's time they learn to stand up and fight. The holographic map shifted, displaying a countdown. The fleet would reach XR Prime in less than 6 hours. Reese turned to his officers, his tone firm. Prepare the fleet. Double-check every weapon, every system. I want us ready to hit them the moment we drop out of hyperspace. The officers saluted and began filing out of the room, but Alric lingered. Once they were alone, he spoke quietly. You're putting a lot of faith in an untested weapon. Rise's expression softened, though his resolve remained. Do you doubt it'll work? Alric hesitated. No, I doubt we'll need it. You know as well as I do, our strength isn't in our technology. It's in us. Riz nodded. That's why we'll win. But it doesn't hurt to have a little extra firepower. The two men exchanged a grim smile before parting ways. As Riz made his way back to the observation deck, he stared out at the swirling vortex of hyperspace. His thoughts drifted to the Vorthens, cowering under the shadow of the Zakar horde. He couldn't help but feel a flicker of pity for them. But that pity was outweighed by something far stronger. Vengeance. As the countdown ticked closer to 0, Riz whispered to himself, they'll wish they'd never come to this galaxy. Arrival at the burning world. The Iron Vow and its fleet ripped out of hyperspace above Axar Prime, the transition shaking the massive ships as they emerged into chaos. The sight before them was one of utter devastation. The planet's surface was streaked with burning cities, vast plumes of smoke spiraling into space. Zakar warships filled the orbit like a swarm of red locusts, their weapons relentlessly pounding the planet below. The Deathworlder fleet, though smaller in size, moved into formation with precision. On the bridge of the Iron Vow, Captain Rice stood tall, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the carnage. The holographic display updated in real time, showing the Zakar forces overwhelming the Vorthens' feeble defense grid. They're already dead if we don't act now, Commander Alric said, his tone grim. They're not dead yet, Riz replied, his voice steady. He turned to his communications officer. Patch me into the Vorthen command. The officer worked quickly, and moments later, a frazzled alien face appeared on the screen. The Vorthen leader was trembling, his pale, thin skin glistening with sweat. Behind him, the sounds of explosions and shouting filled the air. This is Captain Riz of the Deathworlder fleet, Riz said, his tone cold but commanding. What's your status? The Vorthen leader stammered, his voice cracking. We are holding the central city, but barely. Our fleet, it's gone. Our defenses, failing. We didn't think you would come. Rise's expression didn't change. We're here. Keep your people alive. Hold the city at all costs. Reinforcements are inbound. The Vorthen leader hesitated, then nodded weakly. Thank you, Captain. Rise cut the feed. No time for gratitude. Alric stepped forward. Orders, Captain. Rise's voice carried across the room. Deploy squadrons 1 through 5 to engage the outer Zakar ships. Keep their fighters occupied. The Iron Vow and the main fleet will punch through the blockade to clear a path to the surface. Target their command ships first. We cut the head off. The body dies. The officers moved quickly, relaying orders as the fleet surged forward. The first wave of Deathworlder fighter craft shot out of their hangars, their engines roaring as they dove straight into the Zakar formation. The Zakar responded immediately. Their fighters swarmed, meeting the Deathworlders head-on. Explosions lit up the blackness of space as the two sides clashed. On board the Iron Vow, the crew worked with machine-like efficiency, coordinating the assault. The ship's massive cannons roared to life, firing devastating rounds that tore through Zakar vessels. Despite the chaos, the Deathworlders held their ground, their ships moving with calculated precision. "They're regrouping," Alric noted, pointing to a cluster of Zakar warships converging on their position. Race smirked. "Let them. They think we're easy prey. Time to show them they're wrong." He turned to the weapons officer. "Focus fire on their flagships. Take out their heavy hitters first." The Iron Vow unleashed a barrage of firepower, its energy cannons ripping through the shields of a nearby Zakar destroyer. The massive ship erupted in flames, fragments scattering into the void. As the Deathworlder fleet pushed deeper into enemy territory, the battle grew fiercer. The Zakar horde, known for their brutal tactics, began to concentrate their fire on the Iron Vow, determined to cripple the Deathworlder flagship. "Shields holding at 70%, an officer reported, his voice steady despite the tension. "Let them waste their energy," Race said. "We're not here to trade blows. We're here to crush them." Alric glanced at the tactical display. "We've broken through their outer defenses, but the main fleet is still holding near the planet. If we push further, we'll be in range of their orbital cannons." Rice didn't hesitate. "Good. That's where we want to be." Alric raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He knew better than to question Rice's instincts. Meanwhile, on the surface of Axar Prime, the Vorthans fought desperately to hold their city. Alien soldiers, armed with makeshift weapons, clashed with Zakar ground forces in the burning streets. Their eyes darted to the sky, where streaks of fire marked the battle above. "Do you think they'll save us?" one Vorthan soldier asked, his voice shaking as he reloaded his weapon. Another soldier, older and battle-worn, shook his head. "They're not here to save us. They're here to destroy them." Back in space, the Deathworlder fleet closed in on the heart of the Zakar forces. The Iron Vow targeted a Zakar command ship, its cannons blazing as it tore through the enemy's defenses. The Zakar flagship returned fire, its energy beams slicing through the darkness. The Iron Vow shook violently under the assault, but Rice remained unshaken. "Hold the line," he ordered. A sudden alarm blared, and the tactical officer called out, "Enemy reinforcements incoming." 3 additional ships dropping out of hyperspace. Rice's smirk returned. Perfect timing. "All ships, engage maximum firepower. It's time to show them what happens when you corner a Deathworlder." The battle raged on, the Deathworlders fighting with unmatched ferocity. The Zakar horde, accustomed to being the predators, found themselves on the defensive. And for the first time in their history, they began to fear. The trap unfolds. The Zakar fleet regrouped near Axar Prime, their sleek red ships forming an intimidating wall around their flagship, the Chrysalon. The Deathworlder fleet, though smaller, advanced steadily, their movements deliberate and calculated. On the bridge of the Iron Vow, Captain Reyes stared at the holographic map, his sharp eyes focused on the Zakar formation. The trap was almost ready, but the timing had to be perfect. "They're falling into formation around their flagship," Alric reported, his voice tinged with satisfaction. "Just as you predicted." Rice smirked. The Zakar horde always plays the same game: brute force and intimidation. It's about time someone showed them what real strategy looks like. He turned to his tactical officer. "Are the decoys in position?" The officer nodded. "Yes, Captain. The Phantom Wing is ready to engage." The Phantom Wing consisted of smaller Deathworlder ships fitted with advanced cloaking technology. Their role was to bait the Zakar fleet into pursuing them, drawing the enemy ships into a kill zone where the Deathworlder fleet would have the upper hand. "Deploy them," Riz ordered. "Make it look convincing." The cloaked ships shimmered into visibility, appearing just long enough to fire a few shots at the Zakar formation before darting away. The Zakar ships reacted predictably, breaking formation to chase the attackers. On board the Chrysalon, the Zekar commander, a towering figure with sharp insectoid features, growled in frustration. These pests dare to mock us. Crush them. His officers scrambled to comply, redirecting ships to pursue the decoys. Back on the Iron Vow, Rice watched the holographic display as the Zekar fleet fragmented. "There it is," he said quietly. "They've taken the bait." The Deathworlder fleet moved swiftly, surrounding the Zekar forces and cutting off their escape routes. The first wave of Deathworlder ships unleashed a barrage of firepower, targeting the exposed Zekar vessels. Explosions lit up the void as enemy ships were torn apart. "First line neutralized," Halric reported. Riz nodded. "Good. Now we focus on the flagship." The Chrysalon remained at the center of the chaos, its shields holding strong despite the onslaught. The Zekar commander, realizing the trap too late, bared his fangs in fury. "Regroup. Protect the flagship." But the Deathworlders weren't done. "Send in the strike team," Riz ordered. A small Deathworlder assault shuttle, cloaked and undetectable, launched from the Iron Vow. Inside, a team of elite soldiers prepared for their mission. Their leader, Lieutenant Mara, checked her gear one last time before addressing her team. "You all know the plan," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We infiltrate the Chrysalon, disable their shield generators, and get out. No unnecessary risks. We're not heroes. We're professionals." The team nodded, their expressions grim but focused. The shuttle slipped through the chaos, bypassing the Zekar defenses and latching onto the Chrysalon's hull. The soldiers moved quickly, cutting through the outer layers of the ship and entering its interior. The corridors of the Chrysalon were dimly lit, the walls pulsing with an eerie red glow. Zekar soldiers patrolled in pairs, their insect-like limbs clicking against the metal floor. Mara signaled for silence, and the team advanced stealthily, taking out guards with precision strikes. They'd reached the shield generator room, a massive chamber filled with humming machinery. "Set the charges," Mara ordered. The soldiers worked quickly, planting explosives on the generator's key components. But before they could finish, the alarms blared. "They found us," one of the soldiers muttered. Mara cursed under her breath. "Defensive positions. Hold them off while we finish." Zekar reinforcements poured into the room, their weapons firing relentlessly. The Deathworlders fought back, their superior training and firepower keeping the enemy at bay. But the odds were stacking against them. "Charges set," one of the soldiers called out. Mara activated her communicator. "Mission complete. Requesting extraction." On the Iron Vow, Rice received the signal. "Prepare for extraction," he ordered. But before the shuttle could retrieve the strike team, a massive energy surge erupted from the Chrysalon. "They're powering up a superweapon," Alric said, his tone urgent. "If they fire that thing, Axar Prime is finished." Rice's eyes narrowed. "Not if we finish them first. Target the Chrysalon and fire everything we've got." The Deathworlder fleet unleashed a concentrated assault on the Zekar flagship, its shields flickering under the barrage. Meanwhile, inside the ship, Mara and her team fought their way back to the extraction point, the charges ticking down. As the last of the team boarded the shuttle, Mara glanced back at the shield generator room. "This is for everyone you've destroyed," she muttered before detonating the charges. The explosion rocked the Chrysalon, its shields collapsing in a burst of energy. The Deathworlder fleet seized the opportunity, their cannons tearing into the unprotected hull. The Chrysalon erupted in flames, its destruction sending shockwaves through the remaining Zekar forces. On the Iron Vow, Rice watched the spectacle with a cold satisfaction. "And that," he said, "is how you break a horde." The surviving Zekar ships began to retreat, their once formidable fleet reduced to scattered fragments. But Riss wasn't finished. "Pursue them," he ordered. "Make sure they never return." As the Deathworlder fleet chased the fleeing enemy, the skies above Axar Prime began to clear. The Vorthans, battered and broken but alive, looked up with a mix of awe and disbelief. For the first time in their history, the Zekar horde had been defeated, and the Deathworlders had delivered the blow. The turning point. The wreckage of the Chrysalon drifted in orbit, its shattered remains a testament to the Deathworlder fleet's ferocity. Below, the fires on Axar Prime still rage, but the Zekar forces were no longer an unstoppable tide. For the first time, the Vorthans dared to hope. On board the Iron Vow, Captain Rice stood before the main display, reviewing the tactical map. The Zekar fleet had fractured, with a majority retreating, but pockets of resistance remained. Those remnants, still armed and dangerous, posed a threat not just to Axar Prime, but to the Deathworlder fleet itself. Status on the planet's surface. Rice asked, his voice cutting through the room. Commander Alaric tapped a control panel, bringing up a feed of Axar Prime's studies. The Vorthans had regrouped, their soldiers and civilians working together to extinguish fires and fortify their defenses. However, Zekar ground forces still prowled the ruins, terrorizing any who crossed their path. "They're holding the central districts," Alaric said. "But the Zekar still control several key zones, including their orbital cannon outposts. If we don't neutralize those cannons, we're sitting ducks." Rez nodded, his jaw tightening. "We need to divide their forces further. If we spread them thin enough, they'll crumble." The room fell silent as everyone waited for Rice's next move. His mind raced, piecing together a strategy. After a moment, he turned to the communications officer. "Contact the Vorthan leadership," he said. "Tell them it's time to stop hiding." The officer blinked in surprise but quickly relayed the message. Moments later, the Vorthan leader's face appeared on the screen, his expression a mix of relief and fear. "Captain Reyes," the alien said, his voice trembling. "Your intervention has given us a chance we never thought possible. We owe you." "Spare me the gratitude," Reyes interrupted, his tone sharp. "If you want to survive, you'll do exactly as I say." The Vorthan leader hesitated but nodded. "Of course. What do you need?" "Your people need to fight," Reyes said. "We'll handle the Zekar fleet, but your soldiers must take back the planet. We'll provide support from orbit, but this is your battle now." The leader's eyes widened in fear. "Our soldiers are not warriors like yours." "They can't possibly." "Then they'll die," Reyes said bluntly. "And so will everyone else. The Zekar don't leave survivors. You've seen what they've done to other worlds. Now you have a chance to change that. Fight or fall." The Vorthan leader looked away, his thin hands trembling. After a moment, he took a deep breath and nodded. "We'll fight." Rez leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. "Good. We'll target the orbital cannons and remaining Zekar strongholds. Use that window to rally your people and push them out of your cities. This is your planet. Take it back." The feed cut, and Reyes turned to his officers. "Alaric, prep the ground assault teams. We're hitting those cannon installations first." Alaric raised an eyebrow. "You're sending in ground troops." "Not just ground troops," Reyes said with a smirk. "I'm going myself." The room fell silent. Alaric's face hardened. "Captain, with all due respect, this isn't up for debate," Reyes said firmly. "If the Vorthans are going to fight, they need to see us leading the charge. I'll take a strike team and disable the cannons. You'll command the fleet in my absence." Alaric hesitated, then nodded. "Understood." On the surface of Axar Prime, the strike team's shuttle touched down in the shadow of a towering ridge. The Zekar orbital cannon loomed above them, its spiked towers glowing ominously against the smoke-filled sky. The team, a mix of Deathworlder elites and Vorthan volunteers, disembarked quickly, their weapons ready. Rhys stepped onto the rocky ground, his presence commanding. He scanned the area, noting the defensive positions of the Zekar troops guarding the cannon. "Spread out," he ordered. "Take the high ground and wait for my signal." The Deathworlders moved with military precision, while the Vorthans followed hesitantly. Rhys turned to one of the Vorthan soldiers, a young recruit clutching a weapon too big for his thin arms. "What's your name?" Rice asked. The recruit blinked, startled. I'm Laren. Riz knelt slightly, meeting the alien's wide eyes. Laren, you've lived under the Zikar's shadow your whole life, haven't you? The recruit nodded, his hands shaking. That ends today, Riz said. You're not just fighting for your planet. You're fighting for everyone they've ever taken. Remember that. Laren swallowed hard, his grip on the weapon steady. I won't let them win. Riz smiled faintly and patted Laren's shoulder. Good. Now follow my lead. The team advanced silently, their movements swift and calculated. As they closed in on the cannon's perimeter, Riz gave the signal. The Deathworlders struck first, their weapons blazing. The Zikar troops, caught off guard, scrambled to respond. The Vorthans hesitated at first, but Rice's voice cut through the chaos. Push forward. Take the fight to them. Laren, inspired by Rice's confidence, charged alongside the Deathworlders. His shots, though clumsy, found their mark. The other Vorthans followed suit, their fear replaced with determination. The battle was brutal, but the Deathworlder tactics were precise. They cut through the Zikar defenses, pushing closer to the cannon's control room. Riz led the charge, his every move calculated to inspire the soldiers behind him. Inside the control room, the team planted explosives on the cannon's power core. As the timer ticked down, Riz turned to the Vorthans. You did well today. Remember this feeling. This is what it means to take back what's yours. The team retreated just as the explosives detonated, the cannon erupting in a fiery explosion that lit up the sky. Riz watched the destruction with satisfaction. One cannon down, he muttered. 2 more to go. In orbit, the Deathworlder fleet continued to press the advantage, picking off the remaining Zikar ships. On the ground, the Vorthans began to rally, their newfound courage ignited by the Deathworlders' example. For the first time, the tide had turned, but Riz knew the battle was far from over. The Deathworlder edge. The explosion of the Zikar orbital cannon was visible from space, a blazing symbol of defiance against a foe that had long seemed invincible. On board the Iron Vow, Commander Alric observed the scene with a grim sense of satisfaction. The first major blow to the Zikar occupation had been struck, but the cost of victory was climbing. Captain Rice has disabled the first cannon, Alric reported to the crew. 2 more to go. Keep the fleet in position and prepare for counterattacks. The Deathworlder fleet hovered in orbit, maintaining a protective barrier around Axar Prime. Zikar ships prowled the edges of the battlefield, their commanders torn between retreat and retaliation. Zikar reinforcements inbound. An officer called out, her voice sharp. Alric stiffened. How many? 3 warcruisers and an escort fleet. ETA, 5 minutes. Alric's fists clenched. Reinforcements weren't unexpected, but the timing was dangerously close. The fleet was holding, but any prolonged engagement could weaken their position. Prepare the Helios cannon, Alric ordered. A collective murmur rippled through the crew. The Helios cannon, an experimental weapon capable of harnessing the energy of a star, had yet to be fired in combat. It was a gamble. A single shot could either destroy the Zikar reinforcements or leave the Iron Vow vulnerable if it failed. Commander, the weapons officer said hesitantly, if the cannon overheats, we won't have enough power to sustain our shields. Alric's eyes hardened. If we don't fire it, we'll be overwhelmed. Ready the cannon. On the surface of Axar Prime, Captain Rice and his team pressed forward toward the second orbital cannon. The terrain grew more treacherous, littered with debris and craters from the ongoing bombardment. Zikar ground forces had fortified their position, turning the path into a gauntlet of fire. Riz crouched behind cover, his mind racing. The Vorthans with him were exhausted but determined, their earlier victory igniting a spark of courage they hadn't known they possessed. Lieutenant Mara, Rice called into his comm. Report. Mara's voice crackled through the channel. We've scouted the cannon's perimeter. They've reinforced their defenses, turrets, drones, and more Zikar troops than before. "They're expecting us." Rice smirked. "Good. Let's give them a reason to regret it. Have the heavy units target the turrets. We'll handle the rest." The team advanced, their attack swift and relentless. The Deathworlders led the charge, their movements precise and brutal. The Zikar forces, despite their superior numbers, struggled to hold their ground against the overwhelming ferocity of the Deathworlders. Rise's voice rang out over the comms. "Push forward. Don't give them time to regroup." Among the Vorthans, Laren fought with a newfound intensity. The fear that had once gripped him was gone, replaced by a fierce determination. He fired his weapon with precision, his movements guided by the training he had absorbed from the Deathworlders. "Captain," Laren shouted, pointing to a group of Zikar soldiers setting up an artillery unit. Rice turned, his sharp eyes assessing the threat. "Mara, take a team and flank them. Laren, with me." The two charged into the fray, weaving through enemy fire. Riz's rifle blazed, cutting down the Zikar soldiers before they could finish assembling the artillery. Laren followed closely, providing cover fire. As the battle raged, Race spotted a weak point in the cannon's defenses, a heavily armored control hub near its base. "That's our target," he said. "Mara, set the charges. Laren, hold this position and cover her." The young Vorthan nodded, his hand steady as he aimed his weapon. Mara and her team moved swiftly, planting explosives on the control hub. "Charges set," Mara reported. "Timer is running. Let's move." The team retreated, the countdown ticking in Rise's mind. The Zikar forces, realizing their cannon was about to be destroyed, launched a desperate counterattack. "Hold the line," Rise shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The team dug in, repelling wave after wave of Zikar soldiers. Just as it seemed the enemy might overwhelm them, the charges detonated. The explosion rocked the ground, and the cannon collapsed in a fiery inferno. The remaining Zikar forces faltered, their morale shattered. Rise seized the moment. "Push them back. Take the high ground." The combined force of Deathworlders and Vorthans surged forward, driving the Zikar troops into full retreat. In orbit above Axar Prime, the Zikar reinforcements arrived, their warcruisers dwarfing the remaining Zikar fleet. On the Iron Vow, the tension was palpable as the Helios cannon powered up, its energy core glowing with an intense, blinding light. "Cannon at 90%, the weapons officer reported. "Just a few more seconds." Alric stared at the display, his jaw clenched. The Zikar reinforcements were closing in, their weapons charging. "Now," Alric ordered, "fire." The Helios cannon unleashed a beam of pure energy, brighter than the surrounding stars. It tore through space, striking the Lid Zikar warcruiser. The ship disintegrated instantly, the shockwave obliterating its escort vessels and sending the remaining ships into disarray. Cheers erupted on the bridge, but Alric remained focused. "Status on the cannon." "Cooling cycle initiated," the officer replied. "It'll be offline for the next 10 minutes. "That's all we need," Alric said. "Finish them off." With 2 orbital cannons destroyed and the Zikar fleet in disarray, the tide of the battle had shifted decisively. Riz regrouped with his team, their victory on the ground mirroring the triumph in space. As the Deathworlders prepared to target the final cannon, Riz looked to the sky, his resolve unshaken. The Zikar horde had underestimated them, but the Deathworlders weren't just warriors. They were survivors. "Let's end this," Riz said. Vengeance delivered. The final orbital cannon loomed over Axar Prime, its massive structure still operational despite the damage to the other 2. The Deathworlder fleet had broken through Zikar defenses, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Now, it was time to finish what they started. On the surface, the fighting was fierce. The Vorthans, emboldened by the Deathworlders' example, had turned the tide. They fought with a strength and unity they had never known before, reclaiming their cities and pushing the Zikar forces back. But the last cannon remained, a looming threat capable of wiping out everything they had fought for. Captain Rhys stood on the bridge of the Iron Vow, staring at the tactical display. The Zikar forces were scattering, their morale shattered, but the cannon still stood, an enemy that would not yield without a final fight. "Commander Alric," Rhys said, his voice sharp, "how long until we reach the cannon's position?" "Less than 10 minutes, Captain," Alric replied. "We've cleared the last of the Zikar defenses in orbit. The cannon is vulnerable." "Good," Rhys said, his gaze never leaving the screen. "Prepare the fleet for a final assault. I want the cannon disabled, not destroyed. We'll take it as a trophy." Alric hesitated, then nodded. "Understood. What about the ground forces?" "We'll hit the cannon from both ends," Rhys said, his eyes glinting with determination. "I'll take a team and disable it from the surface. You and the fleet will strike from above. We'll make sure the Zikar know they can't keep us down." The final push was underway. As the Iron Vow and its fleet moved to engage the cannon, Rhys and his team boarded a shuttle, preparing for their descent to the planet's surface. On the ground, final assault. The shuttle cut through the thick atmosphere of Axar Prime, shaking violently as it passed through layers of smoke and debris. On board, Rhys stood at the front, eyes fixed on the horizon. Behind him, Lieutenant Mara and a handful of elite soldiers prepared for the final charge. Laren, his hands now steady with experience, checked his weapon one last time. The cannon was massive, an enormous gleaming spire, still emitting faint pulses of energy. Its presence cast a dark shadow over the surrounding ruins, a reminder of the Zikar's reign of terror. Zikar soldiers, despite their dwindling numbers, still guarded the installation, determined not to let it fall without a fight. Rhys's voice crackled over the comms. "Get ready. We hit them hard and fast. Disable the power core, take out the reinforcements, and make sure that cannon can't fire again." The shuttle touched down with a violent thud, its engines cutting off as the team disembarked. Rhys led the charge, his soldiers following in tight formation. The cannon loomed ahead, flanked by Zikar infantry, who immediately opened fire. "Move, move, move," Rhys shouted, his rifle raised as he charged forward. The team advanced with deadly efficiency, taking down Zikar soldiers one by one. Laren fired with precision, his once uncertain hands now steady as he shot down enemy after enemy. Mara moved like a shadow, her swift strikes disabling Zikar turrets and allowing the team to move closer to the cannon's control room. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning metal, but Rhys's resolve was unshaken. "They won't stop us," Rhys muttered under his breath. "We'll break them here, for good." The team reached the base of the cannon, where Zikar soldiers had dug in. Rhys signaled for cover, and the team split into two groups, one to hold off reinforcements, the other to disable the power core. Laren and Mara led the charge against the reinforcements, their weapons blazing. The Deathworlders' precision was unmatched, and soon the cannon's defenders were overwhelmed. Meanwhile, Rhys and his group made their way inside the control room, where a Zikar officer awaited them, his mandibles twitching in anger. "Leave this place, Deathworlder," the officer hissed. "You'll never defeat us." Rhys smiled coldly. "I don't need to defeat you, I just need to finish what we started." With a swift motion, Rhys and his team overpowered the Zikar officer and disabled the power core, setting explosives to ensure the cannon would never fire again. The countdown began. 5 minutes until detonation. Rhys called into the comms. "Everyone, fall back to the extraction point." In orbit, the final strike. Above the planet, Alric's fleet had engaged the remaining Zikar forces in a final showdown. The Iron Vow fired its heavy cannons, ripping apart the last of the Zikar warships. The Zikar reinforcements, though determined, were no match for the tactical genius of the Deathworlders. "Captain Rhys is giving us the signal," Alric said, his gaze fixed on the enemy fleet. Prepare for the final push. With a precise command, the Deathworlder fleet converged on the Zakar's remaining warships. The Iron Vow fired a barrage of missiles, finishing off the last Zakar vessels. The aftermath. Back on the surface, Reyes and his team reached the extraction point, just as the cannon exploded in a fiery blast that lit up the sky. The ground shook beneath their feet, but Reyes' face remained calm, his eyes focused on the horizon. "We did it," Laren said, breathless but filled with pride. "We've won." Reyes looked at the young Vorthan, his voice low. "No, you won. We gave you the tools, but you took your planet back." As the shuttle ascended into the sky, Reyes turned his gaze to the stars. The Deathworlders had delivered vengeance, but more than that, they had given the Vorthans a chance to rebuild. And the Zakar horde. They had been shown that no matter how powerful they believed themselves to be, they were nothing compared to the fury of a Deathworlder on a mission. As the Iron Vow disappeared into the stars, Reyes allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The galaxy had learned a lesson today. When you threaten a Deathworlder's home, you're not just dealing with a warrior. You're dealing with an unstoppable force. The Vorthans would never forget this day, and neither would the Zakar horde.